even though there are a few chairs spare at the front anyway. So if you're standing at the back, please do come sit down so you can rest at least. So today, thank you very much for joining us this morning for what should be a very interesting panel. We're going to be looking at the big question, the energy crisis. Can the UK afford net zero? We're going to be joined, of course, by Steve Baker to my right, who is the Minister for State for Northern Ireland, Minister of State for Northern Ireland, and has served as Conservative MP for Wickham since 2010. He also founded the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of MPs and was formerly chair of the influential European Research Group. To my left, we have Soumaya, who is Britain economics editor at The Economist. She's a journalist and the host of podcasts covering business and finance called Money Talks. We also have Andy Mayer on my left, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the IEA. He's also very interested in all things energy. He comments frequently on free market issues around energy and climate change, and he was also the head of UK public affairs for the world's largest chemical company and green energy advisor to the UK's largest company, which was?
One of those companies.
One of those companies. And on my right, we have Bim Afolami, who has served as MP for Hitchin and Harpenden since the 2017 general election. He's also chair of the all-party parliamentary group for renewable and sustainable energy. And of course, Greg Smith on my right, furthest on my right. He's the Conservative Member of Parliament for the Buckingham constituency. So thank you very much for all joining us. If we could give them all a round of applause for being here today. So I'm going to start with Steve on my right and just pose that question to you. Can the UK afford net zero?
Well, in the short run, when you look at this winter and the energy costs that we face, no. But in the longer run, it's water under the bridge. We're going towards net zero. So let me just justify that and talk about the conversation that we need to be having. So if you look at a briefing from Net Zero Watch, there's several things we could do straight away to take more cost out of the market for consumers. We could suspend the emissions trading system. On the French electricity connectors, if we renegotiated those so they were only used for load balancing and not power export, we could make some savings there. Reduce the value of renewable obligation certificates to zero, and there are some other direct savings. Now, if we did that, the emissions trading scheme can save 10 billion for the economy and £370 per household. The French interconnector negotiation is 22 billion for the economy, £810 per household. The renewables obligation, 229 per household, I'll stick to that, another is £111 per household. Add that up, that's £1,520 per household saved by basically suspending net zero commitments for this winter. And I think that that is something that most households would want to save this winter. So in the short run, no, we can't. Now, what I want to say is that we've got to change the way we're having this conversation. I'm very pleased that the government's going to have two reviews, one on the way the market works, because at the moment it's gas that sets the price of wind power. Get into that if you like. And I'm glad that we're going to have a review led by Chris Skidmore, on who of course is very pro all of the green stuff. It's not like it's a Steve Baker review. People shouldn't be frightened of it. So Chris is going to do that review. But the point I want to make is we've got to have a conversation about four things: why, what, how, what if. So the why is all about risk management and the science. So I'm not challenging the science. You know, I'm an aerospace engineer. I've done plenty of software engineering, MSc in computer science. I used to do thermodynamics for a profession. But crucially, I also used to do risk management. And a really important thing about risk management, which never comes across in this conversation, is you have to look at severity and likelihood. So what happens is the high emission scenarios like RCP 8.5 end up presented as business as usual, and they're not. They're actually, RCP 8.5 I would describe as implausible to the point of being really, really improbable. It's not going to happen. It's not me that says that, it's the IPCC. If you don't believe me, go and have a look at the work of Professor Roger Pilker, who set it out in detail, and I can see one journalist who covers these matters looking sceptical, but I can tell you I've confirmed it from two other sources. One was a conversation with the chairman and chief economist of the Committee on Climate Change. They agreed with me that I'm right. And another conversation was with a climate scientist who came to see me to take me to task over a retweet, if you can believe it. And I asked him, is RCP 8.5 going to happen? And he agreed with me, no, it's not likely. Now, they go on to explain that it's useful to talk about them, but actually, I have to say to you, as an aerospace airworthiness engineer who's managed risks, it's not very helpful to pretend that unlikely catastrophic risks are the main case and prepare for that. So we should insist that the science is presented as science and not politicised for ideological reasons. But I'm not challenging the science. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and human emissions of it have undoubtedly contributed to climate change. The next conversation is, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go to net zero, and until the laws change, that's what we're going to do by 2050. We'll come back to that. The next point is the how. We really need a gas to nuclear strategy, and that's what the Conservative government last time handed over, and Labour got rid of it. But the big problem we've got is that renewables are intermittent. No one can deny that because the dashboards are available to show people. Now, in the last week or so, wind's been doing quite well, but we're back, I see today, to gas providing much more than wind. The reality is that renewables are great when they're available, but they still require, I think it's 11 billion of subsidy is going in, and this is a lot of money to be putting into something which isn't always available. So what we need is a gas to nuclear strategy. We're going to need gas as a transition fuel, and the Committee on Climate Change is clear about that. The EU's clear on that. We need gas. We should go for gas, and we should accept that we need it for the transition. Then the conversation is, what if? Well, that's really where this conversation now needs to move. What if we went faster? What if we went slower? So we should be realistic about the science, clear about where we want to get to, very practical and pragmatic about how we get there, and we should start having a serious conversation about what if. The final point that I'll make is, as anyone can see from the coverage that I get, people keep on transitioning the argument from reasonable questions about how back to why. Oh, you're a denier. It feels like if you ask any reasonable question about, say, the cost of heat pumps, you're a denier. We should call that out as scaremongering and politics. And I can tell you that everything I've said to you, I'm absolutely sure is a reasonable and defensible position. That's why I can sit here and happily say it to you. We have got to say to people who respond to every reasonable question with "we're all doomed," to say, well, actually, no, RCP 8.5 and the high emission scenarios are not very likely, according to the IPCC themselves. Now, let's talk about how. I'm not saying we're not going to get there. Let's talk about how. How are people going to afford it? Because Net Zero Watch can show you how to save another £1,500 this winter, and that's what it's costing the public to keep going. So it's time for us to have a sensible, reasonable, conservative conversation about net zero, and I hope that everybody in this room, wherever they're coming from, can agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for kicking us off. So, Soumaya, would you like to make your opening remarks?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. So just the question of can we afford net zero, the way I think about it is that sometimes in the conversation there's some confusion about counterfactuals, right? And I wouldn't accuse anyone on this panel of having that confusion. But the way I think about it is, imagine we're on Earth and we find out that there's a massive asteroid that's hurtling towards us, right? And the question is, well, can we afford to develop a very, very expensive spaceship to go out and blow up the asteroid as it's coming towards us? And that spaceship might be very, very expensive, and it's an upfront investment for the benefit of not all being exploded into smithereens a little bit further in the future. And so the answer is yes, we can afford it, we have to afford it. The question is, how do you distribute the costs of that, right? We have estimates that we need about £50 billion a year of investment by the end of this decade. And then the question is, how are the costs of that going to be distributed? Now, there are, roughly speaking, three ways of trying to distribute the costs, if you accept that there are these upfront costs and the benefits come later. You could have taxpayers take the burden, which will be unpopular in some circles. You could have taxpayers take on the burden now or in future. You could say, no, we're not going to do this right now. We're going to defer the cost and have future taxpayers bear that burden. Now, the advantage of that is you could design that in a way that was progressive, in a way that meant that those with the broadest shoulders could bear that burden. Politically, there are questions about how popular that will be. The second option is consumers. You could essentially regulate your way to achieving this, in which case companies will put that burden on consumers, will have them pay for the more expensive items, or perhaps just putting the costs, popping, put this away. Or perhaps you could put the costs on energy bills so that it's paid that way. Now that can be very salient. However, there are kind of problems with progressivity there. You could also try and get businesses to pay, which means putting it on shareholders, employees, and consumers, some combination of the three, which presumably the businesses will decide. But someone has to pay at some point for these investments, and so if you argue that one group shouldn't be paying or that one mechanism shouldn't be used, you sort of have to say, well, this other one should be used, right? And to be kind of clear about which of those you want. Now, when we're thinking about how to design this spaceship, right? To design a spaceship that's going to go out and blow up the asteroid, and I really am going to torture this analogy, for which I apologise. Obviously, you can build a really, really expensive spaceship, and you can try and build a cheaper spaceship, right? And the aim of the game is to try and build the cheapest the aim of the game is to try to do this in the cheapest way possible, right? And there is a danger if you go entirely through regulation that you essentially lock us in to technologies that are more expensive than alternatives, right? That is a risk. I think the final point I would make before handing over is that I think generally in the debate one issue can be, and this was raised in a really excellent book written by Eric Lonergan and Corinne Sawyers. What we do when we think about this transition is, economists have focused a lot on carbon taxes, right? Let's set up the right incentives and encourage people to change their behavior away from these high carbon emitting things. And what there hasn't been enough attention to is substitutes, right? So what policymakers are effectively doing by saying, or what economists are doing by saying, look, let's just load everything up on a carbon tax, is they're missing the fact that, well, sure, people need to be discouraged from doing this high emissions thing, but there needs to be something for them to switch towards, right? There's no point in whacking up the costs of doing this very polluting activity if there's nothing they can substitute towards, right? And if you do that, then you're going to essentially just end up with the behavior not changed very much, and consumers having to just pay much, much higher prices without getting that ultimate outcome you want, which is lower carbon emissions. So generally, thinking about the framework, we need to have incentives for people to switch away from polluting things, but we also need much, much more extreme intervention in terms of developing the alternatives. That needs to be the way to frame this discussion, I think.
Thank you very much, Soumaya. May I just let Steve just come in there? He wanted to say something about the spaceship asteroid.
I really appreciate that.
Very quickly.
I remember waking up a number of years ago, before I was an MP, to be told by an early radio bulletin that there was an enormous asteroid heading towards Earth. I thought, because I did study astronautics at university, I thought, oh my God, and started looking at it. Within a couple of hours, they downgraded it to it was going to pass close by, which it duly did. But the point is, it made me go and look at the NASA website, and NASA tracks hundreds of asteroids. And we've just seen, if you go on the news, we've just had an interception event. We sort of are beginning to prepare for an asteroid event. But forgive me, Soumaya, you've just done exactly what I've said. You've taken the conversation about how and can we afford net zero, and you've pivoted back to what if there was an Earth-killing asteroid. As I said early on, likelihood, severity. The high emissions scenarios are implausible. It is not an asteroid heading towards Earth. The analogy is just nonsense. I'm sorry.
Okay, so just to be clear, I wasn't making a kind of very, very scientific point about asteroids and the chance that they would, it was more of a kind of, film with Mel Gibson or anyway, it was more in the kind of, basically, what's the counterfactual, right? I think we actually agree that I mean, the government has legislated that something needs to be done about net zero, right? That was my point, right? That we can't.
If there's a climate emergency, then something on a grand scale has to be made, and it's whether you buy into the idea that we are facing a climate emergency, which is where there's a little bit of difference of opinion on the panel, I must say. Anyway, we will move to Andy Mayer, our Chief Operating Officer at the IEA and our energy analyst.
Well, hi there, everybody. I'm hoping to be a little bit less impactful than an asteroid on this panel. Question, who thinks we are going to solve climate change? That's a very small number of people, really? That many people are skeptical. Is the skepticism based on solving climate change or the date by which it is solved? I mean, when I'm saying solving climate change, I mean ever. In the history of mankind, is climate change a problem we are going to solve? I would hope that would be nearly every single hand in the room.
What does that mean, Andy?
What does that
Andy?
mean?
To solve climate
to solve
change?
Climate change, according to net zero, is to have a balance of emissions. So the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases that you are putting into the atmosphere is balanced off by the amount you are sticking in the ground or using other technology. Now, I think that's an uncontroversial position. I don't have a particular issue with net zero, the science. The science is mundane. The problem we've had with net zero in this country is the theology of monomania, the idea that net zero and climate change are the only things that matter. To be clear, that is an anti-economic position, and it's an anti-environmentalist position. Environmentalism fundamentally is the understanding of trade-offs, as is economics. In the original Brundtland definition of sustainability, you're looking at the environmental, the economic, and the social aspects of all difficult choices and deciding what to do. So the question with net zero and the problem with the government's position is that it has adopted this very hard left socialist central planning model of tackling an environmental challenge and followed through with policies that will inevitably lead that government down the path that it is going on, which is price controls, picking winners in technology, picking losers in technology, if we're looking at gas boilers and the internal combustion engine, and nationalising things eventually, which effectively has now become Labour Party policy. They say it's just to create a state enterprise like EDF, the failed French state energy company. But in fact, what will happen is they'll start off by investing in technologies, they'll crowd out the market, they'll drive other companies out of business, and they'll have to nationalise them, which is what this government had to do in the retail market simply by introducing a very gentle price cap, which has now been replaced by an extremely interventionist one, which actually answers the question that's being asked, which is how much are we prepared to pay for tackling net zero or more widely energy problems? And the answer currently is 100 to 200 billion pounds a year. Now, if that's the bar for a socialist intervention, then almost anything goes. I think I could spend a very small proportion of that on energy efficiency measures and have a far better impact on the climate than anything that will be happening by heating Sam Laidlaw's swimming pool and hot tubs in energy executive homes as a result of this price cap. So we're on the wrong path. How do we get out of it? Well, there are three things that the government could do. The first thing they should do is give Lord Deben a proper job. Now, I don't mean fire him. I mean take the climate regulator and stop them lobbying, stop this weird combination of a hybrid regulator of emissions with a lobbying company, and put them looking at carbon prices in the economy. Carbon prices, carbon taxes do matter. You're never going to have a purist carbon tax. What you can have is a consistent carbon tax, which means that we are not charging white van man £240 per tonne of carbon emitted and somebody flying off on a skiing holiday to lecture the government about climate change much, much less than that. So let's do that, but let's also look at the competitiveness side. We know there's an offshoring problem. Heavy industry in this country is being decimated by climate ideology. What we could do is have that climate regulator look at the effective carbon prices in other countries. Now, this is not the same thing as King Charles flying to COP27 and making agreements and speeches. This is what they actually do. So if the carbon price in Germany is about the same as ours, that's a good thing, that's competitive. If China is much, much lower, that's a problem. So let's keep other countries honest by ensuring our carbon price is somewhere in the region of theirs, not trying to lead the world in expensive energy.
Thank you, Andy.
Do you want the other two?
Go on then, very quickly.
Very quickly. So the second one is restore markets. We have destroyed the energy market that Margaret Thatcher created. It led to rapid decarbonisation with the coal to gas switch. It led to the lowest prices we have ever enjoyed for a sustained period. Every single intervention since under the Climate Change Act and related policies has made that problem worse and left us exposed, sitting on 50 years' reserves of gas, at least, and having some of the most expensive energy prices in the world. That's a complete failure of policy. So restore the market, energy market reform. Finally, and the most controversial point is net zero, the target. I don't disagree that net zero by 2050 is a worthy aspiration. I would love to see that were it possible. But we don't need the legally binding target because in substance it's nonsense. We've just seen from this crisis that when it comes to the crunch, what happens is security of supply, then affordability matter more. So in every sense, it's not legally binding. By tying yourself to it, all you are doing is ensuring that Jolyon Morn is going to put you in court for the next 50 years as you fail to meet the target. So get rid of it, have a more sensible, aspirational, optimistic approach to tackling climate change and net zero.
Thank you, Andy. You're very popular in this tent. Bim, energy crisis. Can we afford net zero?
Well, I don't want to speak up for Jolyon Morn, but I think the best thing for Jolyon Morn is for us to mention him. So I think we should agree not to mention him ever again at a Conservative Party conference. But what I would say is that we can afford net zero and we need to. And in order to make this argument to you, some of you may be sceptical about this, is I'm going to adopt my very good friend Steve Baker's, his framing, the why, what, how, and what if. And I'm not going to mention asteroids either. That's something else that should be banned. So the first thing is why. Everybody so far on this panel, though displaying different degrees of sympathy with this agenda, all agree broadly that the science is correct. So that's why we need to do this. In terms of the what we need to do, this is really the meat of it. Because if you think about the environmental agenda, if you think about net zero, in essence, there are three big things as a country. One is our buildings, one is our generating of power, and the other is transport, getting around. In relation to buildings, we've already heard, even from the deeply skeptical person to my left, though this is probably the only time he's to my left, we need energy efficiency, and we need more of it, and we need markets and the government working with markets to do that better, and I think we could all agree that that's a good thing. That's not just a good thing in and of itself, it means cheaper bills for ordinary people. So I think we should agree that. That's what. A second thing we should do in relation to power generation, we need, I agree with Steve, we need more nuclear. Right? I don't understand the environmental, the sort of, what I'd call as the sort of children of Greenham Common, or the grandchildren indeed of Greenham Common, who say they care about the environment, but then you want to do nuclear and they don't seem to like that. So I think we need more nuclear. Yes, we need gas as a transitional energy source as well, but it is transitional because it does increase carbon emissions. So we need nuclear, we need gas, but critically we need wind and solar. And yes, there are people that say, oh, they're intermittent. Of course they're intermittent, but that's why you have a range of different energy sources. That's why we're including nuclear to be sort of baseload energy all the time. We have some of the windiest coastline in the entire world in the United Kingdom. Let's use it. And sorry for fishermen, but let's use as much offshore wind as we can. It's cheap, it's effective, and most importantly, when there is a war going on in Eastern Europe, we are not subject to Vladimir Putin or anyone else. So for the people that say, oh, we don't really like this intermittent energy, okay, well, we can get oil, or not coal so much, but we can get oil, for example, or liquefied natural gas from other parts of the world where we are dependent on others. I think that's a less good outcome than us generating more of our own energy. And in relation to transport, battery technology is critical. It is improving all the time in this country because of Cornish lithium, which, by the way, we should develop and we should take on people who say we shouldn't do it. There is a huge demand for batteries all over the world. Lithium is a key ingredient. It can help reindustrialize our country, provide jobs for people, and high-paying, high-skilled jobs as well. That is a good outcome. Quickly, the how, well, the how is how we actually pay for this is, I agree with the other panelists that have talked about using incentives rather than, is that like a Bollywood thing or something? Anyway, we're very diverse, Tory Party conference. No, so we should use incentives as much as we can, carbon pricing as much as we can. I think the point about competitiveness with other countries is critical. I can't bear to be lectured by another country about what we should be doing on carbon emissions when they are burning coal. Right? So I think that there is a fairness and competitiveness argument which will help us reindustrialize our own country. And the final point I want to make to you in my last seconds is, what if we don't? Let's just say we don't bother. Let's cross our fingers and hope for the best. It might be okay. But if it isn't, not only is that really significantly bad for our environment, at some point, friends, or even comrades, we may face a Labour government. And when you face a Labour government, at some point, I know it's a horrifying thought, what they will do, if we have not acted, is they will do much more severe intervention. They will do much more communist, socialist, bonkers things to destroy our economy in the name of helping the environment. And we will lose the argument in the country. What we need to do is we need to take steps now in the short, medium, and long term so that we can not only do this in a conservative free market way, but stop the lefties destroying our country as they try and take it on in the years to come. Thank you.
So I guess, Bim, you reject Andy's characterisation of Tory policy as being socialist central planning. Greg, finally on our panel, will you give us your opening remarks? Can we afford net zero?
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everyone. Well, first of all, I think the paper I should commend to all of you to read first up is actually a paper of the Free Market Forum, which is a project of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which I am lucky enough to chair, called Green Light, which was deliberately put together earlier this year, published in the summer, with a series of articles of free market solutions to some of the environmental challenges we face. There's stuff in there about hydrogen. There is stuff in there about synthetic fuels that I'm going to go on to talk about in a few moments. There's even something on artificial meat. I'm not sure I'm in favour of artificial meat, but there is an article in there on artificial meat, because the market is out there. The market is generating the answers to Steve's very valid and very good question about how we get to the net zero goals that the government has, as Steve rightly points out, legislated for, that is set in our statute book. But when we come to this question about can we afford it, I think it is absolutely vital, as we look to those solutions, as we look to the market, as we look to the great innovators we have in this country and that exist around the world, we are always very, very aware of the unintended consequences and the costs of going down an ideologically driven, a very dogmatic path to net zero. Now, I sit on the Transport Select Committee. I am an unapologetic, unreconstructed petrol head myself, and so I'm going to focus on the transport sector and on the way we fuel the future to try and just unpack a few of the points around whether we can afford, in the current manner in which we are heading towards net zero, the costs and the unintended costs that go with that, whilst equally pointing to some of the solutions that the market itself is producing. And just as none of us, well, certainly no one in this room, but our relatives that went before us 100, 120 years ago, just as none of them had to have state intervention or big state sticks or even incentivization to give up their horses and buy vehicles powered by the internal combustion engine. They did so because there was a better product on offer. It is my contention that there are better products on offer that are coming down the line that all of us as human beings, as citizens of the United Kingdom, will choose to take. So let's look at some of those unintended consequences. Let's look at bioethanol in our fuel. Last year, government doubled. Oh, is Steve Bray outside? He normally plays that, doesn't he? He'll start shouting in a minute, don't worry. We can talk louder, can't we?
Yes.
So the government doubled. You've all seen your fuel quotes when you've filled up with petrol in your cars that you now have to put E10 fuel in it, doubling the bioethanol content. Any guesses on what the estimated cost to consumers of putting bioethanol, double the level of bioethanol in petrol is over the next decade? Any guesses? £23 billion out of all of our back pockets. That is the cost to us of putting fuel in our cars that won't make the car go as far as it did when you were putting E5 in it. And then let's look at some of the other unintended consequences that hit us as a wider economy of doing that. We're all aware that the cost of food is going up. We're all aware of inflation, right? We're all aware of the knock-on effects of Putin's invasion of Ukraine has had on global grain markets. Well, in order to grow the crops that will then be burnt in our cars, if the land used for growing that was actually used to grow crops that we are going to eat, or even our food is going to eat, we could actually feed 3.5 million people more a year. That is the cost, the unspoken cost, a lot of the time, of going down some of these paths. And we're doing it in a very short-termist way. I was privileged enough to get to know last year, this is my petrol head-on again, Paddy Lowe. Paddy Lowe used to be the chief mechanical officer, the chief mechanic at Mercedes-AMG F1, at McLaren F1, at Williams F1 before that. He understands that the combustion engine has 100 years plus of development in it. It's really quite good. And he set himself the challenge with some very clever scientists at Imperial College of developing, on his own money and investors' money, not on state money, on taxpayers' money, a synthetic petroleum. And it's essentially, it can be made in any industrial unit of mixing hydrogen. No, clearly there's hydrogen and there's hydrogen, but he has only used green hydrogen with thin air, or the carbon in air, to generate an entirely synthetic petroleum, diesel, aviation fuel, plastic. He flew an RAF plane on this fuel last November. He didn't have to change a single fuel filter. No alteration had to be made to the mechanics, the engineering, the engine of that aircraft. It flew with exactly the same power output as it would with regular aviation fuel in it. No dropouts, nothing bad whatsoever. Got him into the Guinness Book of Records as well. It just worked in what we've already got. And that is scalable. You can make that in an industrial park. You can make that with a few, 1,000 square feet of industrial unit in any industrial park, in any of our constituencies, in any of our counties or districts or cities or boroughs around the country. And if you scale it, it will be profitable. And it works in what we've already got. So we're not having to see taxpayers' pounds subsidizing these massive gigafactories, on literally reinventing the wheel in the way that we power our motor cars, our aircraft, our ships, our trains. The market is developing these solutions. And yes, there might need to be some incentives along the way. But my point is, we are spending a lot of money on making our day-to-day lives more difficult, on making our cars not go as far as they did when we put E5 petrol in them, costing food security in this country and abroad. And so to Steve's very valid and correct question, how? Let's look to the market. Let's look to these great innovators like Paddy Lowe. And let's hit those net zero targets, but do so in a way that we understand as conservatives, as free marketeers, and of people that look to the great innovators, not to the state, to give us the solutions.
Thank you, Greg. I will ask the first question. This really is to everyone on the panel. One of the frustrating things about living in this brilliant country is that we sometimes aren't able to get things done. The energy crisis that we currently face has proven that we don't have security of supply in this country as we should. Yet you do unfortunately have a lot of Tory MPs, Conservative MPs, who don't want anything built in their backyard. So that could be a solar farm, or it could be fracking. And I am worried that the government has said they're going to end the moratorium on fracking, but will it actually happen in this country? It seems impossible to get anything done.
Can I take this first? So there are 2 points here. In relation to, for example, getting nuclear, renewable energy done on land, we've got to confront, dare I say it, people like the people on this panel and people like you in the audience who, when they say they want more houses, we say we want things built, we say we want renewable energy, we say we want energy security, and then when it wants to come near us, we say no thanks. And we're just going to have to take this on. And I think that one of the very good things in the Chancellor's growth plan is the desire to speed up and improve our planning system. That needs to happen. In relation to fracking, I doubt it's going to happen in many places for the large reason that it's very unpopular in most parts of the country where it's proposed to go. There are a lot of MPs that are on record in those areas of saying that they don't want it. And that even if you fracked absolutely everywhere that is proposed to frack, the actual difference that it makes in terms of cost is minimal, if any at all. And so, bearing in mind the political cost, I think that actually that may not end up happening in the way that some people think.
Greg, would you like to make a comment?
I think I'm very conscious that I am guilty of opposing a lot of things being built in my constituency, and I do so for a very good reason, because I've got 19 miles of the railway that dare not speak its name. I dare not speak its name, but it begins with H. And yeah, I'm clearly on record as being opposed to a lot of infrastructure. I know, Bim.
Would you oppose a few solar panels on a muddy piece of land?
So let's unpack some of this. Why am I against HS2? I'm predominantly against HS2 because it's a total waste of money for a demand that in fact does not exist. And we are spending 150, 160 billion pounds on this thing. Carving up, yes, the countryside and my constituency and robbing people of their businesses and their farms and their homes in the name of a railway that is entirely state-sponsored. And I'm a free marketeer. I think if there was a case for that railway, if there was genuine demand for that railway, the private sector would be falling all over themselves to try and invest in it and build it themselves. The fact that they're not should tell us everything. But on solar farms, again, it's the unintended consequences. I'm a big fan of solar energy. I think there is a great, great future for the use of solar on the roofs of every factory, on the roofs of every building, on the roofs of the ICC right next to us. I bet there aren't solar panels. I'm sure I'm about to be proved wrong, but there is a great case for getting solar panels across our country. Silverstone Racetrack in my constituency, they've done it. They've covered the roof of the wing, the pit building with solar panels. It's going to be fantastic. But when those applications come in to put solar farm equipment, to build these things on agricultural land, there is a trade-off because it means we can't grow food on it. I know the consultants say that you can still graze a sheep under these panels. Well, maybe you can in year one. Year two, when you've covered the field in plastic, metal and glass and the grass hasn't grown underneath it anymore, the sheep might go quite hungry. But there is the trade-off for the food security, the ability for our farmers to grow the crops or to graze the livestock that we want and need. And I think we do have to have that debate as a country as to where we're willing to have those trade-offs, because if we cover every piece of agricultural land in the country in solar farms, we won't have any food.
Yes, I mean, my point was not that I love solar farms and I want them to cover our whole countryside. It was more that we have a problem getting things built, whether it is fracking or whether it's a renewable energy piece. Yes, Steve?
Thanks very much. So I'm a Conservative because I'm an unrepentant old Whig, so I hope you won't mind if I answer this question through that framework. The big failing of the Conservative Party is, of course, our conservatism. We tend to try and make the system work which Labour have given us. And one of those systems is the one that follows from the Town and Country Planning Act. We hear a lot about place and the value of place, but most of the places around me that people really value were built before the Town and Country Planning Act. What happens, we keep adopting socialist systems of doing things and then wondering why they don't work. State land use planning isn't working. I think even as a minister, that is sufficiently factual that I can say that without getting fired. The problem we've got is we don't align incentives. So in Wickham, the Labour Party wrote to me when I came out and said we needed to go for shale. If shale gas was discovered in Wickham, would I support fracking? And I replied, well, A, it isn't going to be discovered in Wickham because there isn't shale gas in Buckinghamshire. But second, if it is, start under my house. Why? Because there's a railway line next to my house, and the seismic impact of fracking would be just unnoticeable compared to the trains that go by. And so much nonsense has been spoken about fracking. It's unbelievable. It's just, again, it's politicisation of science. It's ridiculous. I have to say as well, though, there's a drilling engineer in my constituency, and he has designed a drill bit which is going in the ground, which can get shale gas out of the ground without fracking. I think one of the things we've all not realised is that shale gas is actually under extremely high pressure deep in the ground. I'm not going to get into the detail, but the point is, there's going to be a way of getting shale gas out without fracking, and this conversation should go away. But again, what I would say is we need to accept that if you let markets work, and actually amongst the MPs here, there's so much commonality, we'll definitely survive as a party through this, won't we? Yeah. So, but what I would say is if we just would let markets work and let incentives work and let the public share in the benefits of the things in which they're participating, whether it's shale gas or nuclear power or HS2 or whatever, instead, what we do is we keep imposing externalities on people and telling them to just suck up the disadvantages. And that is the socialist way of doing things. And of course, it's never going to work. And it's about time we Conservatives stop being quite so conservative and we're a bit more radically liberal.
And I agree with a lot of what Steve said there. In particular, I'll give you an example from my own constituency. There are, in parts of the home counties, I'm in North Hertfordshire, proposals for solar farms, coming up from landowners. And when I say to these companies that are going to these landowners with these projects, I say, well, can you explain how you are persuading the local residents who are all writing to me saying they don't want it, that they should have this thing? Are you going to give them free energy for 10 years, or are you going to do something like that? They say, oh, no, we can't do that. It's too difficult. And until you give people a direct benefit, which is what in the United States I think they do a lot better than we do, then why would you expect people to accept something which they see as a net negative? We need to change the system so that people get direct benefits for things, and then they will accept things that come near them, but not if you're just imposing it on them.
Money talks, I guess. Andy, is fracking worth the hassle? I'm sure it might divide people in this room, whether it's worth going ahead with. Will it actually save us money on our bills at home?
Well, so to declare an interest, I live in a constituency in the Weald which has fracking licenses. And if that now goes ahead, I imagine I will be the only person out there on the street saying, hooray, hooray for fracking, because I take the energy crisis seriously. And it's very simple. At a macro level, you either frack here and expand operations in the North Sea to provide a domestic source of gas that you can then tax and spend on things like reducing the cost of decarbonisation, or you're importing it. You're importing it from Qatar, you're importing it from the US, where it is fracked. So there is no environmentalist case for stopping fracking in the United Kingdom. I agree with Bim about incentives, but the industry is very wise to this. They look at the current regime, £100,000 for communities for a well and 1% charge on the revenues, and say that's probably not enough. And it's not enough to give it to the community. You've got to give it to people directly, as with the US system. So let's have a much higher charge and let's have direct payments. That will not overcome all opposition. We know that in Surrey, that people oppose the opening of a bag of crisps. One of the big debates that we had when I moved into the area was whether or not a muddy field next to a motorway should be converted into something for delivering Amazon parcels that might have been quite useful during the pandemic. So fracking could go ahead, but it's got to have a fair, proportionate regulatory system. So to go to Bim's other example of the lithium mine in Cornwall, that can probably go ahead because it doesn't have a ridiculous traffic light system for seismology. Fracking deserves to have a same regulatory system as any other business, and then let's see if it goes ahead or it doesn't. It's not pick winners or losers.
Soumaya, would you like to comment on that? The government does have a way of picking winners and losers and often getting it completely wrong.
Ooh, yeah, I mean, I guess...
Take diesel cars, that classic example.
Yeah, so I guess I want to make a point about, I guess your original question was about, whether we can get stuff done, right? And I think my, big picture response to that was that if you compare the UK to other countries, there does seem to be some differences in the way that we deal with planning. What's unusual in the UK is that we have an unusually large number of sort of no points, right? There are many more veto points along these processes than in other countries. I mean, we're not an extreme outlier, but in general, we tend to have more veto points, right? And so I would actually completely concur with the idea that you need to, one, streamline, and then two, kind of align incentives, so that if you decide you want to do these things, then there needs to be either a kind of local tax benefit, and perhaps those taxes get poured into to local spending. People who have the power to veto needed to have a reason not to veto. And so we need to fix those systems.
Great. I think we should throw to the floor, because I'm sure you've got many interesting questions. This lady here at the front. Guardian Helena Holton.
Thank you, Steve. I was
I've
going
been
to say
told.
that myself, but that's very helpful. This question is actually for you, Steve. So you said something about we have to meet net zero at the moment because it's in law, but unless you repeal that, is that something the government is considering? Is that something you've been speaking about with the government? And also, are you still a member of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group? And how is that okay, being a minister and being a member of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group? Because I know you quit as trustee of the GWPF. Thank you.
So the first thing is, no, I'm not having any conversations with ministers about it at all, whatsoever. I'm absolutely consumed with being Minister of State for Northern Ireland. I accepted the invitation to be on this panel before I was put in government, and I just thought it would be rude to decline it. And of course, you will know that I've always very carefully crafted how I approach this problem, and so I've felt able to say what I've said today, thinking that I probably won't get fired, but it needed saying anyway. So I continue to be a member of large numbers of WhatsApp groups, because you can't exit them if you start them. I've started them. I don't intend to participate in them. But membership of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group is just being in a WhatsApp group. So, I am still a subscriber to the ERG, and I intend to continue being a subscriber to the ERG. But I will behave absolutely in line with the ministerial code. I have no comment. I'm not having that conversation with the government. I am in the government. I'm not having that conversation with ministers. I think we have to... All I want in the end, Helena, as I think you know, is prosperous people who can be happy and energy secure. And I think we all agree on that in here. But I'm not lobbying other ministers for this. No, I'm too busy trying to get power restored in Northern Ireland and the protocol sorted out, and worrying about what we're going to do about the budget if the Assembly and the executive isn't back. It's quite a big problem. So once I'm out of this room, I'm probably not going to think about net zero for a very long time.
He's got enough on his plate, and you can't boot yourself out of your own WhatsApp group, so that does make sense. Any more questions? Maybe I'll take a couple at a time. This chap in the middle. And who else had their hand up? The chap right at the back, standing up.
Sure. Louis Plowden Wardlaw, Terrestrial Energy Limited.
Sorry, what was that?
Louis Plowden Wardlaw, Terrestrial Energy Limited. We're a company that's financed by private capital, bringing advanced nuclear to the marketplace. And I found much of what you've been saying to be very conducive to what we're trying to do in terms of transforming the market, particularly for industrial heat. And what I would say is that the government at the moment is coming out with some excellent rhetoric on the deployment of nuclear and taking some useful steps. However, it is micromanaged in a way that makes it very difficult to commit capital to the country to forward such projects, because the timescales for things like DCO, the availability of sites being, there isn't a mechanism for saying, okay, if you bring the capital to the country, the offtake will be at such and such a price, and brownfield sites will be available. But the possibility for repowering the country and reindustrializing it with heat for clean, decarbonized industry is there for the taking.
Thank you very much. And the second question, the chap at the back. Sorry, in the middle here.
Hi there. We're talking about, obviously,
Sorry,
environment.
could you say where you're from? Sorry, quickly.
Sorry, I'm an electrical installer, so I should not have this opinion. But my morals basically say that, we do a lot of battery backup, solar, all that sort of thing. Where is the moral question where all of the stuff that we're actually getting is from China? So they're building coal power plants to fund our fetish with sort of solar panels.
Yeah, and using slave labour.
Okay. Now, Andy, I know you have a lot to say on nuclear. Seems like it's too difficult, too bureaucratic.
Yeah, so I love nuclear power, and I don't like the nuclear industry, and those two things are entirely compatible, because the hope and dream of nuclear power eventually is affordable, secure energy that in the olden days used to be described as too cheap to meter. What we've ended up with instead is an extremely difficult, largely state-owned set of corporate industries that can't deliver to their own targets. So when the government's own impact assessment looked at the nuclear financing bill, it noted that the estimated time for building a new nuclear power station was 14 to 17 years. And it put a price tag on Hinkley Point at 68 to 120 billion pounds, which begins to make the price cap look affordable. Now, that's clearly not where we want to be. What we want is affordable, competitive nuclear power. And we need many more companies involved, and we need some deregulation of the nuclear industry, which is not trying to deal with obsessions about safety risks that don't really exist to the level people think they do. The nuclear industry is largely safe. We should be able to build it far faster, and small modular reactors are the bright hope for that, but we should be taking their bids with a great deal of scepticism, because the experience of government time and time again is the industry cannot deliver what they say they can. So let's restore the market, make it a lot easier to build nuclear power, but make sure that we don't just give them subsidies.
Bim, in terms of the China question, is there a moral hazard or a moral question around us getting so many of our components of renewable energy from China?
I think it's primarily not a moral question for me personally. It's an economic competitiveness question. And if we have a scenario where we are not allowed to do things in our own country, or indeed in Europe and other developed countries, and outsourcing this to a country that isn't doing the same things we're doing, paying them good whack for it, and that preventing our own industry doing that thing, say, for example, producing solar panels or whatever, preventing our own industry from developing because they can do it cheaper, that's an economic competitiveness question. I think it's almost very personal as to whether people find the Chinese government, the morality of it. But as a politician, I prefer to deal in economic competitiveness rather than morality where I can. And it strikes me that the Western world is going to have to grow up and accept that in order to achieve the very laudable, important goal of net zero, improving our economies for everybody, we're going to have to reindustrialize it to some degree. And in order to do that, we are going to have to take on countries, not just China, but others, who seek to benefit from our laudable ambition through doing things cheaply and dirtily in their own economies.
Does anyone have any... Oh, sorry. Does anyone have any more comments on either of those questions? Otherwise, I'll take a couple
just
more.
very briefly, say on nuclear, there is a role for state action, which I hate saying as a laissez-faire liberal in spirit. But I understand the problem is regime uncertainty, that you're not going to be able to roll out, and hopefully you nod, you're not going to be able to roll out a large number or an adequate number of advanced nuclear reactors because we can't get the fuel produced, and we can't get the fuel produced because you can't be sure you'll get them rolled out and all the rest of it. So we are going to have to do something to enable sufficient certainty in the planning system and sufficient certainty about the demand for fuel that you can actually get them rolled out. And it is, of course, a state failure, not a market failure connected to the planning system.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in a point on trade, and I think there's been a lot of discussion in European Commission in the EU about how to deal with this problem of I guess this competitiveness point, right? So if you're importing things that have different standards, and that is kind of unfair competition and somehow hampering your domestic industry. I think the thing I would say is that I think it needs to be about consistency. I think the danger when you start imposing trade restrictions is that your domestic industry sort of sees it as a free lunch. And sees it as like, great, well, we don't like them over there doing this thing, and we want them, so we want them to be shut out, but we actually want weaker restrictions ourselves, right? So I think the instinct of, our companies are having to deal with these incentives to cut emissions, this carbon price or whatever, and therefore it's kind of reasonable to expect our foreign competitors to face similar costs. That is a kind of healthier way of thinking about it than the direction that some in the EU, I think, have been lobbying for, that would just sort of shut out and not do the kind of tough homework at the same time.
Great. Now we've only got 5 minutes left, so can I take 2 very quick questions? Okay, this lady here and this chap here with the glasses. Sorry, there are 2 men with the glasses. Sorry, this blonder one here. Yes, to start with you.
Hi. The biggest problem with getting a renewable energy application over the line at the moment is access to the grid. So we have actually access to the grid in Herefordshire, and we could put a renewable energy scheme in, but it has to be solar, and it has to be and if it's solar, it has to be on our most profitable best land. If we could put it at the top of the hill, it could be wind, and onshore wind would be absolutely perfect. We would have access. We could do the whole thing very quickly, but at the moment there's a moratorium on onshore wind. Is that something that could be considered? Is there any reason for that?
Thank you very much. And question here.
This is all about being led by the lowest cost of the market, and we've talked about the failure of government's policy around nuclear. But I just put it to the panel, why is no country on earth prioritising investment in nuclear over renewables?
Steve, would you like to come in on the access to the grid problem for renewable projects?
That fundamentally comes down to the planning system and democratic consent for what's done. And I just refer to my earlier remarks and my much longer remarks in the House of Commons in 2013 about what should be done instead, and what I said in the think tank last year about it. The planning system's not working. People don't want wind turbines on tops of hills. On the other point, I mean, why aren't they? But that's a good question. But the point I would make is in the end, there's no getting around that our advanced civilization needs continuous power, and lots of it. And you can look at GridWatch or whatever your preferred dashboard is, and you can see that day after day, after week, gas produces more power than wind. And we've got enormous amounts of wind turbines out there. And,
You've been watching the graphs throughout the panel.
I have. But I would just add that what you see in those graphs is what I know as a sailor. Most of the time, mostly around the world, there's not very much wind. And that's why old square-rigged sailing ships used to carry so much canvas. And what's incredible about the 21st century is that lessons we've really known for hundreds of years, we're now unlearning and thinking we can get continuous power from intermittent sources. And it's stupid. It's really genuinely stupid. And the reason it's especially stupid is because in the market as it works at the moment, it's gas that sets the price of the wind. And then we've disincentivized investment in getting gas out of the ground. I mean, the nexus of stupidities that we're now surrounded with, and forgive me if you're from Octopus or something, was it Octopus? But the childish preschool nonsense we get from Octopus with the cutesy octopus and wind is free and gas is expensive. Oh, they have got lovely branding, but really we've got to have a more grown-up conversation than wind is free.
Steve, I will have to accept those words as your final and closing remarks. Greg, what does the government need to do differently? 30 seconds, if you may.
The grid question is a hyper complex one. I've seen it in my own constituency. We have got to look at all the sources, but to me it still comes down to nuclear, because you can get the SMR in a very small land parcel. You cannot get an entire solar farm in a very small land parcel. So you come back to the trade-offs I was talking about earlier. Nuclear can power us in that continuous way long into the future, as Steve said, and that's where my priority is.
Bim, 30 seconds.
To take on the point very directly, why is it that most countries are not investing more in nuclear? 3 reasons. One is the nuclear industry has been beset by so much regulatory change every single minute that it's very, very difficult to replicate what they do in one nuclear power station to another. So the costs keep going up, so it's cost, first point. Second point is bonkers environmental movements that somehow think that nuclear somehow isn't morally correct. And so various countries, the German government in particular, has been warned off nuclear because of that. I think that's the second point. And the third one is that they're actually much further behind than we are on the net zero journey. So they're still burning a lot of coal and oil.
Thank you very much, Soumaya. No final remarks?
No final remarks.
You've said
that's
enough?
fine. I think
You've had enough?
yeah, I can talk about asteroids again if anyone wants. Or
Asteroids. Well, who knows what's coming? Andy, final remarks.
Yes, just on the renewables point, I think Dieter Helm was right about this, that the social costs of renewables are intermittency and grid connection, and renewables should account for those costs and then compete in an open market. If that were the case through something like capacity firm auctions, then there may be a chance. But it can't be the case that renewables can simply pretend that they're very cheap, then dump vast amounts of power on the grid, destabilising the grid without there being any storage backup. That's how we've got into this very dangerous situation about security of supply.
Thank you very much. Could you give the fantastic panel a round of applause? Thank you very much for coming to the think tent. May I just let you know that next in here we have is the UK's approach to apprenticeships failing the levelling up agenda? And that's with Chris Clarkson MP, Robert Halfon MP, and lots of others. So please do hang around if you want to.